The day Gary Sutton got fired, he was holding a mop, not metaphorically. An actual mop, yellow bucket, gray strings, the kind that smells like bleach no matter how many times you wring it out. He was in the east corridor of the Meridian Grand Hotel's administrative wing, mopping up a coffee spill someone had left near the photocopier, when Diane Kowalski— no, wait, when the director of operations came clicking down the hallway in her heels and stopped dead in front of the glass-walled boardroom. Her name was Laurel Moss. 41 years old, freshly promoted 6 months ago from regional manager to director of operations for Meridian Grand's flagship Toronto property. She had the kind of confidence that fills a room before a person does, shoulders back, chin level, a voice that never quested, always told. She stopped because she saw Gary through the glass. Gary was 47. He had a name badge that said Gary S. Facilities, clipped slightly crooked to the breast pocket of his gray uniform shirt. He was tall enough that the mop handle looked almost comically short in his hands. And he was standing in the boardroom doorway, not mopping, not cleaning, staring at the whiteboard on the far wall with a look on his face that Laurel did not like. She pushed open the glass door. "What are you doing in here?" Gary looked up. "There was a spill by the boardroom is off limits during prep week. You know that, the door was open." "I saw. I don't care what you saw." She stepped inside, looked at the whiteboard, the rollout plan for the hotel's upcoming rebrand, event logistics, cost projections, the whole thing mapped out in color-coded markers. Then she looked back at him. "Did you touch anything?" Gary said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "No." Laurel studied him. Something about the way he said it, not defensive, not nervous, just quiet and flat, made her more suspicious, not less. She'd been in hospitality long enough to know what it looked like when someone was hiding something. "Leave your badge at the front desk," she said. "I'll have HR contact you." Gary looked at her for one long second, then he unclipped the badge from his pocket, set it carefully on the edge of the boardroom table, and walked out. He didn't argue, he didn't explain, he just left. And that, more than anything else, was the thing Laurel would keep turning over in her mind in the weeks that followed. Gary Sutton had not always mopped floors. 10 years earlier, he had been the head of event strategy at Thornfield Hospitality Group, one of the largest independent hotel management firms in Ontario. He'd built their event programming from the ground up, the seasonal packages, the corporate retreat formats, the whole visual identity for their conference spaces. He'd won 2 industry awards. He'd been the kind of person other departments came to when they needed someone to think. Then his wife, Karen, got sick. It wasn't fast. It wasn't one of those stories where everything changes overnight. It was slow, a diagnosis in the spring, a second opinion in the fall, treatment that worked for a while and then didn't. Gary stayed in his job for the first year, taking calls from the hospital parking garage, eating vending machine sandwiches for dinner, bringing his son Eli to school every morning before driving to the office and doing 8 hours of work in 6 because he had no choice. Eli was 8 when Karen died. He was 10 by the time Gary accepted that he couldn't keep a senior strategy role and be the father his son needed at the same time. Something had to give. He stepped down voluntarily, took a lateral move that wasn't really lateral at all. Facilities coordinator at a mid-range hotel in Mississauga. The pay drop was significant. The hours were more predictable. He could pick Eli up from school. He could be home for dinner. He told himself it was temporary. That was 5 years ago. Eli was 15 now, and Gary had been at Meridian for 8 months, brought in on a recommendation from a former colleague who managed the property's facilities team. The work wasn't glamorous. Nobody at Meridian Grand knew what Gary had done before. Nobody asked. He showed up, he did the job, he went home. He was good at disappearing into a role. He'd learned that too. The morning after he was fired, Gary sat at the kitchen table in their apartment in East Toronto and drank his coffee while Eli ate cereal across from him. Eli didn't ask why he was home. He was 15, he noticed everything and said very little, which was a quality Gary had always recognized in him and sometimes found exhausting. Gary didn't offer an explanation. He looked out the window at the parking lot below and thought about the whiteboard. Because the truth was, he had touched something. Not maliciously, not even consciously at first. He'd been standing in the doorway with his mop looking at the rollout plan on the whiteboard, and his brain had done what his brain always did, processed it, mapped it, found the problem. The event pricing structure for the rebrand launch weekend was wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. Whoever had built the cost model hadn't accounted for the union labor differential that applied to after-midnight setup crews. It was the kind of error that wouldn't show up until the invoices came in, and by then it would be $15,000, maybe $20,000 short of what they'd budgeted. Gary had picked up one of the markers from the tray. He'd written 4 numbers in the margin of the board, circled them, and drawn a small arrow to the column they affected. Then he'd heard heels in the corridor, set the marker down and stepped back. He hadn't had time to explain any of that before Laurel Moss told him to hand over his badge. He drank his coffee. He thought about calling his contact in HR. He thought about not calling. "You okay?" Eli asked from across the table. "Yeah," Gary said. "Just thinking." Eli looked at him for a moment, then went back to his cereal. He had the same eyes as Karen, gray-green, slightly too observant for comfort. Gary looked away. "I'll figure it out," he said. It wasn't clear if he was talking to Eli or to himself. 3 weeks passed. Gary picked up a short-term contract with a facilities company that did maintenance work for commercial office buildings downtown. The money was fine. The work was anonymous. He dropped Eli at school, worked 8 to 4, picked Eli up, made dinner. At Meridian Grand, nobody called. He hadn't expected them to. He hadn't given them a reason to. But on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week, a number he didn't recognize showed up on his phone. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "Is this Gary Sutton?" The voice was clipped, professional. "Not Laurel Moss." "It is. My name is Preston Hale. I'm the general manager of the Meridian Grand Toronto. I wonder if you'd be willing to come in for a conversation." Gary was quiet for a moment. "A conversation about what?" "About a problem we're having," Preston said, "and something we found on our whiteboard." Gary took the meeting. He almost didn't. He'd sat with the phone in his hand for a full minute after hanging up, turning it over, thinking about what it would mean to walk back into that building. Eli, when Gary mentioned it that evening in the vaguest possible terms, just looked up from his homework and said, "So you're going?" "I haven't decided." Ellie went back to his homework. "You'll go," he said in the flattest possible tone. "You always go." Gary didn't know whether that was criticism or just observation. With Eli, sometimes you couldn't tell. He went. The Meridian Grand's administrative offices were on the 4th floor, away from the guest areas. Gary had been up here a handful of times for facility briefings. He hadn't been in the GM's office before. Preston Hale was 60-something, lean, with white hair and a way of looking at people that suggested he was running several calculations simultaneously. He stood when Gary came in, shook his hand and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Laurel Moss was sitting in the other chair. She didn't stand. She looked at Gary with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not cold, exactly. Not apologetic either, something more complicated than either. "Thank you for coming," Preston said. "Let me be direct. The launch weekend we had planned for the rebrand, it went significantly over budget, finances still untangling it. The labor costs came in almost $19,000 over projection." Gary said nothing. Preston continued, "Our facilities team was reviewing the boardroom the week after the launch prep. Someone noticed some handwriting in the margin of the cost breakdown on the whiteboard. Numbers. An arrow. Whoever wrote it had correctly identified the problem with the labor calculation, the union differential that the events team had missed. We had the whiteboard photographed before it was cleaned," Laurel said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was controlled. "Our accounting team confirmed that whoever made that annotation was right. The actual figure came in within $300 of the number in the margin." Gary looked at the desk. He looked at his hands. He thought of the way the marker had felt in his hand, a reflex almost involuntary, the same way he'd started correcting wrong numbers since he was in grade 10. "That was you," Preston said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." A silence opened up in the room. "Why didn't you say something?" Laurel asked. Her voice had shifted slightly, something under the professional surface, not quite irritation, something more like frustration with herself. Gary considered the question honestly. "You'd already told me to leave," he said, "and I'd been through enough rooms where people don't want to hear what the guy with the mop thinks." Laurel held his gaze. She didn't look away. He gave her credit for that. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I did, the way I handled it, wasn't right. I made an assumption based on where you were standing and what you were wearing. That was wrong." Gary believed her. He'd been in enough professional settings to know the difference between an apology offered to smooth things over and one that cost something to say. This one cost something. "I appreciate that," he said. But then Preston leaned forward, folded his hands on the desk and said, "I'd like to understand something, Gary. How did you know that?" Gary looked at him. "The labor differential, the union clause. That's not common knowledge for a facilities worker. That's hospitality finance. Where does someone learn that?" And there it was. The question Gary had been half expecting for 8 months. The question he'd somehow avoided by keeping his head down and doing the work and not volunteering anything. He could deflect. He was practiced at it. Instead, he told the truth. He talked for about 15 minutes. He told them about Thornfield Hospitality Group. He told them about the event strategy work, the programming, the industry awards he hadn't mentioned on his facilities application because the gap between that resume and this job would have raised too many questions. He told them about Karen, briefly, without self-pity, and about the choice he'd made and why. He told them about Eli. He didn't dress it up or make it sound more dramatic than it was. He just told them what happened. When he finished, the room was quiet. Preston Hale sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Gary. "I want to offer you a contract position," he said. "Event strategy consultant. We're 14 months into a rebrand cycle and our planning is behind." The person who was leading it, he paused and something crossed his face that Gary couldn't interpret, "is no longer with us." Gary glanced at Laurel. Her expression didn't change, but something in her jaw was tight. "What happened to them?" Gary asked. "It's part of what we need to discuss," Preston said. "But I'd like to know first, are you open to the conversation?" Gary thought about Eli, at school right now, probably staring out the window through whatever his current class was. He thought about the morning after he was fired, the coffee going cold, the parking lot below. He thought about what Eli had said. "You always go. Tell me about the person who was leading it," Gary said. His name had been Theo Marsden, mid-30s, polished, the kind of person who interviewed extremely well. He'd been brought in 8 months ago. Around the same time Gary had joined the facilities team as it happened, specifically to manage the rebrand rollout. He had the right credentials, the right language, the right confidence. What he'd also had, Preston now explained, was a relationship with a competing hotel group's consulting firm that nobody at Meridian Grand had known about. The cost model error, the one Gary had caught, wasn't an accident. Preston's voice stayed even as he explained it, but Gary could hear the controlled anger underneath. Marsden had deliberately built the miscalculation into the projection. When the rebrand launch went over budget, the board would scrutinize the program, confidence in the direction would falter, and at a key moment, the competing firm, the one Marsden had a quiet arrangement with, would position itself as the solution. It was a long-play sabotage, patient and precise, the kind that's nearly impossible to trace without looking at the right column on the right spreadsheet. Except that Gary had stood in the doorway with a mop, looked at the numbers for 30 seconds, and written 4 figures in a margin. "He's been let go," Preston said. "We're working with legal. But the damage to the rollout is done, and we need to rebuild the plan from the foundation, which is why I want you in the room." Gary was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the window, at the winter light on the buildings across the street. The position would pay what? Preston named a number. It was close to what Gary had been making at Thornfield a decade ago. Not what he'd eventually earned there, but close. More than enough. "And the hours," Gary said. "I have a son. I need to be home before 6 most days." Preston didn't blink. "We can structure it that way. 3 days on site, 2 remote." Gary looked at Laurel. She was watching him with that same complicated expression. He didn't know her well enough to understand it, but he had the sense she was someone who was hard on herself in proportion to how certain she usually felt, and that the last several weeks had been uncharacteristically hard. "I have one condition," Gary said. Both of them waited. "I want to see everything Marsden built, every document, every model, every projection. Not to fix it, to understand how deep it goes. If we rebuild without knowing the actual foundation, we'll miss something." Preston nodded slowly. "That's exactly the right instinct, and I want to be straight with the team," Gary said. "About who I am, what I did before. I don't want to walk in as some external consultant who materialized from nowhere. If I'm going to work with people, they should know what they're working with." Laurel said quietly, "That's fair." Gary looked at her. She met his eyes. There was something in the exchange. Not forgiveness exactly, because she hadn't done anything he couldn't understand. She'd made a snap decision with incomplete information. He'd done the same thing at different moments in his life. The difference was that hers had cost him a job and his had cost him, well, other things, harder things. "All right," he said. He started the following Monday. He told Eli on Sunday night, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes still in the drying rack. He kept it brief. New contract, different work, back to what he used to do. Eli looked up from his phone. "Is it the hotel?" Gary had forgotten, or told himself he'd forgotten, that Eli knew where he'd been working. "Yes, the one that fired you." "They didn't exactly." Gary stopped. "Yes." Eli looked at him for a long moment. He had Karen's patience too, the ability to hold a silence without filling it. "Will you be home before 6? He asked. "Most days, yes." Ellie nodded once and went back to his phone. Gary sat at the table for a while after Eli went to bed, in the quiet of the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the winter wind finding the gaps in the window frame. He thought about Marsden, a man he'd never met, who had constructed something careful and rotten and nearly invisible. He thought about the 4 numbers he'd written in a margin without even thinking about it, the reflex that had set everything in motion. He thought about Karen, the way he always did late at night, not with the sharp grief of the early years but with something quieter now. Something like a conversation he carried with him. "You always knew," she'd said to him once, when they were still early in their life together, when he'd flagged a problem in a contract she'd brought home from her own job. spotted it while she'd been walking him through it at the kitchen table. You can't turn it off. He'd laughed at the time. He didn't think it was particularly useful, knowing things. You could see a problem clearly and still not be able to do anything about it. That was the part nobody talked about. But sometimes it turned out you could. The work was hard in the way he'd forgotten work could be. Not the physical exhaustion of facilities, the ache in his knees from tile floors, the soreness across his shoulders at the end of a shift. This was the other kind of tiredness, the good kind, the feeling of a brain being pushed past its comfortable margins. The Marsden documents were a maze. 3 layers of deliberately introduced ambiguity, 2 sets of financials that tracked slightly differently, a vendor relationship that looked clean on the surface and wasn't. Gary worked through them methodically in a small office off the main floor that Preston had cleared for him, with a whiteboard of his own. On Wednesday of the first week, Laurel came in and stood in the doorway, not confrontationally, just standing there, looking at the board. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. The day you were in the boardroom, were you trying to help or were you just?" She seemed to search for the right word. Compelled. Gary thought about it honestly. "Both," he said. "I saw a number that was wrong. I could not see it. And yes, I thought it would help someone eventually. I just didn't think I'd be the one explaining it." Laurel nodded. She looked at the whiteboard for another moment. "I want you to know what I said that day, about people not wanting to hear from the guy with the mop." She paused. "I've been thinking about that. I don't think I've ever explicitly thought that. But the way I acted, I think you were right that it was in there somewhere." "It usually is," Gary said. Without accusation, just as a fact, she left him to his work. By the 4th week, he had a full picture of the damage. He presented it to Preston and the board in a meeting that lasted 2 hours, starting from the beginning, showing the layers, explaining where each distortion had been introduced and what it had actually been masking. $19,000 of direct budget loss. A vendor contract that would have locked Meridian Grand into an above-market rate for 3 years. A partnership deal structured so the benefit flowed entirely to Marsden's arrangement and not to the hotel. The board was very quiet. Then they asked Gary to lead the rebuilt rollout. Not as a consultant this time. They offered him a title, Director of Event Strategy, a position that hadn't existed on their chart 3 months ago and existed now because they'd created it for him. Preston said the role should have existed before Marsden. It will exist after him. And I'd like it to be you. Gary asked for a night to think about it. He drove home. He made dinner, pasta, the simple one Eli liked, with the garlic and olive oil and whatever herbs were still in the fridge. Eli talked about a project he was doing for his history class, about immigration patterns in Western Canada, and Gary listened and asked questions and was genuinely interested, the way he was always genuinely interested in what Eli brought to the table. After dinner, Eli said, "So, did something happen today?" Gary looked at him. "What makes you think something happened?" "You made real dinner," Eli said. "When things are normal, you make cereal. You make actual dinner when you're processing something." Gary laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes out before you've decided to laugh. Eli smiled at his plate, the small private smile he'd had since he was 4 years old. "They offered me a job," Gary said. "A proper one? The hotel?" "Yes." Eli considered this. "Is it what you used to do before? Closer than anything's been in a long time." Eli looked at him steadily, the gray-green eyes. "The patience. Then you should take it," he said. "You've been putting the other thing back on the shelf for 5 years. It's starting to warp." Gary didn't say anything for a moment. "When did you get this observant?" he asked. "I've always been this observant," Eli said. "You just don't usually ask." He took the job. He called Preston the next morning and said yes, and they arranged the formal offer for the end of the week. He signed the contract on a Friday afternoon in the same boardroom where 4 months earlier he had stood in the doorway with a mop and been told to hand over his badge. The whiteboard on the far wall had been replaced with a newer one, larger, with a magnetized surface. It was clean and white. Gary stood in front of it for a moment on his own before the meeting started. He picked up a marker from the tray, uncapped it. He thought about Marsden, patient and methodical and wrong in a way that had taken an accident to catch. He thought about Laurel Moss and the complicated look she'd worn in Preston's office, the one that had turned out to be something like a reckoning she was having with herself. He thought about Eli at school right now, probably staring out the window. He thought about Karen. He thought about the way a number sits wrong on a board, the way your eye catches it even when you don't want it to, even when you're holding a mop and you're tired and you just want to finish the corridor and go home. He uncapped the marker and wrote the date at the top left corner of the board. Then he waited for the others to arrive.